human beings can materialize the invisible, that human beings can actually take the imagination and translate into reality. All of us are living inside of someone else's imagination right now. And so when I look at the human species and I go, what humans can do is we create futures. There are individuals who are an unexpected iteration of human capacity. Mozart changes the game for composition. Einstein changes the game in the world of physics. Bobby Fischer changes the game in the world of chess. 98% of us are born geniuses, 2% of us live out that genius. I think it's the same with human creativity. It's the same with human imagination. I've been a part of TED for like 20 years, and I listen to the TED Talks, and I've been a part of that community, and there's always someone who's an expert on a species, and they highlight why that species has so much value. And one of the questions I kept asking myself is, well, who's up there advocating for the human species? And what makes humans unique? What makes us different than every other species? And one of the things that really struck me was the one thing that human beings can do that no other species can do is that human beings can materialize the invisible. That human beings can actually take the imagination and translate into reality. Mm-hmm. There is no other species that can do that. Now, other species may be able to imagine, but they can't translate that imagination into reality. And so here's what I think is fascinating. If you looked at species from a purely objective level, from a naturalistic perspective, what human beings can do is, what bees create honey. Right? Silkworms create silk. Like ants create colonies, beavers create dams. Humans create futures. We're the only species that can create future. If the planet was left to every other species, the planet would stay in its present. It would never change. It would evolve in a natural way, but humans have an ability to imagine a future that does not exist and create it. We have this table, we have this book, we have this beautiful studio. It was all in someone's imagination first. And so before there were all these bulbs, before there was the School of Greatness, it was inside of your imagination. And so when I walked into the studio, what I realized I was doing, I wasn't just walking inside of a room. I was walking inside of the imagination of Lou's house.
Right. From years ago.
That's right.
Yeah.
I stepped into your imagination here. You've invited me into your imagination, and now it's a part of my reality. All of us are living inside of someone else's imagination right now.
That's interesting.
This nation exists because it was in the imagination of Jefferson and Washington and Franklin and Hamilton. With all of its imperfections, we're living inside of the imagination of these people. MLK Jr. said, I have a dream that one day a man will be measured by the content of his character and not the color of his skin. When Barack Obama took the oath of office and became the president of the United States, he was literally walking inside of the dream of a man who no longer lived because he had been killed, but his dream could not be killed.
Wow.
And we were now living in the imagination of MLK Jr. We were living inside of the imagination of others who fought for a better world. And so when I look at the human species and I go, what humans can do is we create futures, then I go, okay, that is an intrinsic genius, whether we recognize it or not.
So we all have genius within us.
I'm absolutely convinced of that. Now, it doesn't mean we all actualize that genius. And it also doesn't mean that we all have genius at the level of an Olympian. And so we have to recognize that there are individuals who are an unexpected iteration of human capacity. Mozart changes the game for composition. Einstein changes the game in the world of physics. Bobby Fischer changes the game in the world of chess. Tiger Woods changes the game in the world of golf. Michael Jordan changes the game in the world of basketball. You have individuals who change the game. Picasso changes the game.
Why are some people more genius level than others then? Why are they the anointed or chosen ones, or did they choose themselves?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. There was a man named George Land who worked for NASA, and he was asked, I think around 1968, to develop an assessment so they could find geniuses to work for NASA.
Interesting.
So George Land developed what was a genius assessment, and they gave that assessment to 5-year-olds. 98% of 5-year-olds were identified as geniuses. They did a longitudinal study, followed these kids for the next 10 years. When they were 10 years old, only 30% of them still tested as geniuses. By the time they were 15 years old, only 12% of them were identified as geniuses. I think it was 128,000 people then were graphed, and average age 31, only 2% could be identified as geniuses. So the question doesn't seem to be, is there genius inside of everyone? The question really needs to be, what happened to the genius that was inside of everyone?
What happened?
98% of us are born geniuses, 2% of us live out that genius.
Interesting.
I think it's the same with human creativity. It's the same with human imagination. A part of the mistake of adulthood is that we see maturity as equivalent to standardization. If I can make you the same as everyone else, you're now an adult. If I can teach you to be standardize and to conform, you are now an adult.
Right.
And I think neuroscience tells us that by the age of 12, our brain has decided who we are. So whatever you focus on before the age of 12, that becomes your mental capacity.
It's harder to break out of that later.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. So if I asked you if you were a linguistic savant, you would probably say
no.
No. In fact, you'd probably say you're bad at languages.
Yes. At this point, yes.
How old do you think you were when you learned English?
1, 2. You're starting to pick it up, I guess, right away.
Right, so you're 1, 2 years old.
Yeah.
And you're learning one of the most difficult, complex languages in the world. When you were 2 years old, Louis, you were a linguistic savant.
Right, that's true.
If they'd moved you to Tokyo, you'd have learned Japanese without any difficulty.
That's true.
They'd moved you to Manila, you would have learned Tagalog. And if they'd moved you to England, you would have finally learned real English.
Exactly, yes.
And if you'd gone to Buenos Aires, you would have learned Spanish. And the crazy thing about it is at the age of 2, you had all the attributes of genius, of a linguistic genius.
Wow.
And if you'd had the benefit of moving to 4 or 5 places from the age of 1 to 10, you might have learned 2, 3, 4 different languages.
Right.
The reason Americans only speak one language is because their brain knew they only needed one language to survive and to thrive.
Right.
Your brain will only learn and hold the capacity for what it needs to survive.
Wow.
And so Spanish was my first language. I came to the States when I was young. I learned English right away. I remember early on my report card said transitional period, learning English. But the truth was, I could read that. I just didn't tell them because I knew I wouldn't get grades and, for a while. And I say this without any sense of accomplishment. It was easy. Learning English was easy. I wonder how many different aspects of human genius were simply left unnurtured. And so we lost them along the way. And
so how do we recultivate them at later stages in life?
Well, I would step back and go, what's the most important aspect of genius to recultivate? The likelihood that I'm going to be Mozart is not going to be really high, or to be Picasso, or to be Bobby Fischer. And here's the crazy thing about genius. It's really irritating because it's not transferable. I could spend my life with Mozart and I would never become a world-class composer.
You can get better, but maybe you're not going to be world-class.
If anything, I might just become bitter.
Or more frustrated, exactly.
Because, you see, what genius does is it makes greatness look ordinary. And so that's why a lot of people, when they become an expression of genius, they're actually despised by their peers. And I could spend my life with Picasso and never paint like Picasso.
Right.
Or, I could spend my life with Bobby Fischer and never learn how to become a master in chess. But the genius of Jesus, which is why I wrote about it, is the singular genius that's transferable.
What is that?
It's how to be fully human. And as I was studying genius for the last 40 years, I was always struck that there wasn't a single list that had Jesus on it, of geniuses. The most renowned genius in history is probably Leonardo da Vinci. And he's sort of like the iconic genius. In fact, a lot of my life was shaped around the aspiration of Leonardo. And I would study da Vinci, I would study his thinking, I would study some of his practices, and I tried to emulate them and take them on in my life, which is why I worked at becoming ambidextrous. It's why I would do so many things right-handed, and as opposed to left-handed, or left-handed, so it was right-handed. Tried to use both sides of my brain, and tried to develop practices of Da Vinci, just trying to become more creative and more adaptive, more pliable mentally. But if I spend my life with Da Vinci, I'm not going to become Da Vinci. And so what you realize is that genius is not transferable. There is one exception. It's the genius of Jesus. If I could, I just wanted to go back to where the idea of the book came from. I was in my back house during quarantine, and I was by myself having a conversation with myself. And I'm sure you do this too, Louis. You ever have conversations, there's almost like 2 or 3 people in your head?
Sure.
Which is why, we're never lonely, right? Or alone. And so I'm having this conversation with myself, and this thought just comes crashing through my head. How weird that my entire life revolves around a person who lived 2,000 years ago. As you know, I'm a follower of Christ.
Yes.
And I believe deeply in Jesus. And I just thought, this is so bizarre that I live my life studying the teachings of Jesus. I live my life teaching others about Jesus. I live my life trying to emulate the principles of Jesus. I live my life believing I have this relationship with Jesus. And I thought, this is so weird that my whole life revolves around this person of Jesus. And then I had this follow-up thought with the other person in my brain, what if Jesus isn't real? How do you explain this? And so then I had a counter thought, and the other person in my head said, well, even if Jesus isn't real, the change in me is real. So how do I explain that? I thought, okay, so I could say, all right, Jesus really isn't God, but I can't say I haven't been changed by Jesus. So then I had this follow-up thought, well, then I've been changed by the idea of Jesus, which I thought, okay, so there's 2 options. This is the way my brain kind of works. I've either been changed by the reality of Jesus, that he really is who he says he was, or I've been changed by the idea of Jesus, which is to me almost more extraordinary. So I began this process where I extricated all my belief in Jesus. And I said, all right, Jesus, I'm going to put all your miracles and everything in the mythology category. And now I want to know.
As an idea. It didn't happen, but it was a myth.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then, or he was a real person, but there's a lot of mythology around him.
Yes.
Right? So the teachings were real, but the mythology was added to the teachings. So I just went from that perspective.
Yes.
And then I thought, all right, why isn't Jesus on any list of geniuses? Does he qualify as a genius? What is his genius if he was one? And why would that genius be so overlooked for 2,000 years? And one of the first things I did is that's chapter 1 is all about what genius is. It goes all the way back to the etymology of genius coming from the word genie. That the ancient Greeks actually believed that you were not a genius, you had a genius. That genius was given to you by the gods, and it wasn't really for you, it was for others. You were a steward of that genius.
Interesting.
And so I thought this is interesting because from the very beginning, the observation of genius is connected to divinity. And then I started wondering, why are so many geniuses just accepted in their madness or in their lack of humanity, right? And then I realized it's almost like this tension of genius seems to be an expression of both madness and of the divine. And so then I started breaking it down, going, okay, does Jesus qualify as a genius? And then I started asking, well, why is this genius not identified? And I realized it's about the canvas. See, when you're a genius, you have a canvas in which your genius is expressed, whether it's physics or mathematics, whether it's science or botany, whether it's sports or music or art. But Jesus's canvas was the human spirit. And so when you realize, oh, the reason Jesus's genius is not easily observable or identifiable at first is because he wasn't trying to change art or music, he was changing us. And what his genius did is it actually changed people. I mean, think about this, 2,000 years later, there are people who actually want to do good in the world because of Jesus, who want to live lives of generosity and sacrifice because of Jesus, that I became a part of that canvas. 2,000 years later, I'm a part of that art form of the genius of Jesus. And then it exploded in my brain. Whatever you believe about Jesus, his genius is transferable. Because what you find is all over the world from every generation and every culture, every level of education or economic status, that when a person is genuinely affected by Jesus, they actually want to live for the good and the beautiful and the true.